a change in the strategic context. The Prime Minister, in the forward to the Strategic Defence Review, talks about a step change in the threats that we face, and that requires a step change in defence. What I say to our people when I spend time with them in town halls and speaking publicly to them is that more is going to be expected of us as a set of armed forces in a context of greater volatility, greater levels of uncertainty. And you can see that play out in a whole number of different ways. We can see the instability in the Middle East over the last few days, and who knows where that's going to end. But also, very clearly, we can see the threat from Russia and the commitment that NATO has made to increase the targets that are set on us, and the commitments that this government has made to increase defence spending, all point to increasing demands on our armed forces, both in terms of warfighting at scale, but also in responding to crisis around the world.
Right. I mean, you just mentioned about the increased tensions. Now, within that context, it would be a mild way of putting it that we are extremely disappointed. Many of us are, in fact, exasperated that the Defence Investment Plan still remains a working document. It's reported that the reason for the delay is money, or the lack thereof, or the allocation thereof. We were promised that this would be delivered in autumn. We're now in January. There are rumours and widely reported statements that it could be March or beyond. What's going on? Who's got a handle on this at a time when there is so much tension? We seem just to be trundling along rather than realising the urgency of the moment.
I completely agree with the concerns that the committee has, and I've heard reflected in Parliament about the delays. I heard some of the statements from members of the House of Lords and previous people who've sat in my chair on Today in Parliament last week. I think what it represents is it gives you an indication of some of the challenges that we're facing with the world that's changing, with the programme changing around us, and the need to make sure that we get that right. There's no point having a defence investment plan that can't be delivered or is unaffordable. And I think that what ministers want and what the Defence Secretary is absolutely clear on, and I know Rupert Pearce, the National Armament Director, is in front of you before Christmas, yes, made clear. We're working flat out to try and bring that to a conclusion. And I'll be very happy through the session today, Chair, to talk a bit about some of the challenges and some of the questions that we're trying to address and how that process works. I think that would be quite helpful for the committee. We
fully appreciate the challenges, but you haven't got a date that you could give to our committee today.
I do not have a date for when that work will be finished.
Well, also, I understand that your good self and other senior military leaders met up with the Prime Minister, and you intimated about a warning of a staggering £28 billion shortfall, defence shortfall, and that's despite the extra money coming into defence, despite having known about this changing strategic context. And apparently the Prime Minister was livid, since he felt that the Strategic Defence Review was fully costed, fully funded. What's going on there? Can you enlighten us?
I thought you might ask me about the speculation in the media about the cost of the programme and speculation over particular numbers. And that's exactly what it is. It is speculation. But what I'm not going to talk about.
There's no shortfall. Are you happy there's no £28 billion shortfall?
So what I will tell you is that we meet the Prime Minister regularly. He has been very clear that defence and security should be a central organising principle for government, and he is personally taking a keen interest in those aspects, and I was with him in Paris on Tuesday last week. And I will tell you that we did meet the Prime Minister in December, and we did talk about a number of issues associated with defence, including the Defence Investment Plan. But the material that was discussed at that meeting was classified secret, and so I'm not going to talk about that in public. And I suspect, Chair, and we know each other well, yes, there's a danger that we get into a to and fro today where you ask me about a particular number for a programme that hasn't been signed off, where decisions haven't been made, and the number, you can ask me the question as many ways as you like, but I'm not going to be able to talk about those specifics because we are not at a stage yet where we understand precisely what the cost of the programme will be, because there's a whole bunch of judgments that will need to be made. And I thought, as I said, what might be useful is if I talk to you a bit about what's really going on and how we approach these issues.
No doubt we'll come on to that, Chief Marshal, but you will understand that there's a lot of speculation around and that will be swirling. I completely understand that you cannot give us a specified number, but can you at least confirm, is there a funding shortfall and a significant funding shortfall at that?
I think what I need to explain to you how this process works, because the cost of the programme depends on a whole bunch of assumptions that we might make, and ultimately it'll be a matter for ministers to make those based on the advice that I and others offer. It's very clear that the demands on defence are growing. It links back to your very first question. The SDR set out very clearly the kind of increasing uncertainty and volatility in the world, and the risk, therefore, to our security, and the importance of the UK's armed forces to the country and its security. It also made clear, or the government has made clear, that over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we are not as ready as we have taken a peace dividend, and we are not as ready as we need to be for the kind of full-scale conflict that we might face, and that's how we ultimately deter our principal adversary, is through being ready to fight and win. And part of that is also about how we modernise and transform the armed forces to make sure they're ready for that fight in the future. And it's all of those things that we have to take into consideration in terms of how we are going to deliver the plan in the future.
I completely take on board this point, and that's, a lot of that work has been advised to the public at large through our inquiry reports into the UK's contribution to European security and so on. But my question was, is there a shortfall?
So, we're going to talk about this to and fro. The answer is, it depends on the assumptions you make. So government ministers have made a decision around the level of budget that they have provided us in defence. That is unprecedented in my career. This is the largest sustained increase in defence spending that I've known. The Prime Minister stood up in The Hague and in Parliament and committed to spending 5% on defence and security, 3.5% on hard defence, 2.6% by 2027. So that is the envelope that we are working within, and I think that demonstrates the commitment that the government has made to the challenges we face. And this is huge. On my last day as head of the Air Force, I was at RAF Cranwell, and I was talking to a bunch of people who are about to graduate, and I was explaining to them that they are entering an Air Force, they're entering a set of armed forces in a context that I have never known. Agreed. With rising defence budgets. And this is it's a big deal in terms of what's happening. But my role is to advise ministers and the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister about how we rebuild our armed forces with the money that they have provided. And it is a statement of the obvious that we can't do everything we would want to do as quickly as we would want to do it within the context of the budget we've set. And that requires ministers to make difficult trade-offs, and that's the work we're going through. And it's hard, and that's why the Defence Investment Plan is we're working so hard on the Defence Investment Plan.
My views exactly, and I've raised that on the floor of the House, that some of us were disappointed that there wasn't more in the budget about defence, in fact no new money. Are you expecting further money for defence within the upcoming spring statement, based on your conversations with the Prime Minister?
So as far as I understand it, the Treasury and the Chancellor has set the budget for departments for the next few years as part of the spending review, and so that's the assumption that we are working on.
I meant with regards to the spring statement. Obviously you've made strong statements to the Prime Minister last week, as you said, while you're away. Many of us, especially I know all Defence Committee members, have been asking on the floor of the House as well. But are you expecting any more money within the spring statement?
So that is absolutely a question for ministers. They decide what the allocation should be. They make trade-offs between health and education and defence and all of those kinds of matters. My job is to set out for ministers what the threats are, what the armed forces are able to do in the face of those threats within the budget that we have. And there's a whole set of issues that will affect your judgment about how much money defence needs. For example, we should, in any department, hold a degree of financial contingency. The bigger that contingency is, the less money is available there and then to spend. And the limits that then limits what we are able to commit to. So the judgment around that contingency will matter. There's also the balance in the budget between the resource costs and the capital costs, and quite a lot of the uplift in our budget has been capital costs. So that's about investment, not about running costs. You'll know that we made a big, and I'm unapologetic about it, a big increase in pay for our armed forces, and that's important if we want to retain and recruit the very best that the country needs. And what we have to make a judgment around, what's the right balance between investing in the transformation that's called out in the SDR, that's investing in filling in some of the hollows that the SDR referred to, and how quickly we're able to address those challenges and transform. So all of that taken together is a complex set of circumstances, and the judgments you make will determine either how much money you need or what you can do inside the cost envelope. And it's hard. It's a really difficult set of problems. Changes in the environment. You heard the Defence Secretary on Friday saying that we are spending money on enhancing capability in case we have to deploy forces into Ukraine after a peace deal. All of those factors add complexity and uncertainty, and those are the issues that we are trying to address through the Defence Investment Plan. Okay. And I'll continue to provide clear and straightforward advice to ministers on those things, for them to make the judgments about what that means for capability, what that means for international standing, and what that means for the budget.
Well, none of us is under any illusion that you haven't got a very complex and urgent task at hand, but some of us are just mindful that other people outside of the Ministry of Defence may not, in the wider government, be aware of the urgency at hand. Right, I've got a handful of supplementaries based on the issues that I've just raised with yourself, starting off with Derek Twigg.
So yes, is there any scenario that you can explain to us where, without cutting the programmes or railing back on planned work, that there wouldn't be a significant shortfall in funding?
So I said
is there any scenario that would mean that wasn't? It's very simple, straightforward.
I said to Laura Keansburg when I spoke to her on the Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, that if we are going to transform our armed forces, invest in new capability, then that's going to require us to make changes to the rest of the programme. And so it depends on those judgments that we make.
With respect, I'll be very specific about my question. And I take what you said about, you don't want to go to the details of the programme at this point. But the question is quite simple. Is there any scenario that can be delivered without cutting current programmes or reducing planned work that's in place that would ensure we don't have any funding shortfall without extra money from the Treasury? Is there any scenario? Can you describe?
Are you saying that?
What I'm trying to say is there any possibility based on what what you're currently looking at, which doesn't involve cuts to programmes or again putting back programmes for a number of years, which wouldn't bring about a funding shortfall without extra funding from the Treasury? Is there any scenario?
So I think your question is that if we wanted to do everything that's currently in the programme and do all the extra things in the SDR, could we do that with the budget that we've got? And the answer is no. I mean, it's painful. It's
So
absolutely true.
basically, we are talking about cuts to programmes.
What you have to do is make some judgments about what you prioritise, how big the
I know you don't want to
contingency
use
is
the
going
word
to be,
cuts, but we are
how,
going to be
how
reducing programmes or changing programmes or putting programmes backwards.
all of those things are,
Yeah.
are options
Okay.
under consideration. But also, so is the level of ambition that we might take. And these are just straightforward and.
So without doing that,
Facts.
there is no way you can avoid a funding shortfall. That's what you're saying.
That's not what I said at all. You just put words in my mouth. What I said is,
I think that's what I'm thinking.
could we deliver the whole of the programme that we currently have and do all of the things that we would want to do in STR with the
You
money
would
we've got?
make
No,
cuts.
no.
You would make cuts.
So we can go back and forwards,
Well,
Mr.
unless
Twigg,
I'm
all the
misunderstanding
time.
something, if you've got a programme that you can't deliver, you cut it, don't you?
So there are a whole bunch of things that are not yet in the programme.
So you
Because we have choice over
delay
how.
or decide not to go ahead with them.
So you have choice over how quickly you want to do them, and that's it. I mean, it's just a straightforward thing.
Okay,
right? And I know you want to kind of put words into my mouth,
No, I
but
think
it's
I
important
understand.
that we.
I think I
we
understand
are
exactly
clearly-
what you're saying. I
clearly
think
obvious.
we all understand from what we just said that you cannot continue the way you are without avoiding cuts to
No,
the
you see, I
programme.
didn't say that, Mr. Twigg. You
Oh, so
keep
you're
putting
not
that
gonna cut
into
the
my
programme
mouth. You keep using that word, and you keep wanting to. What is helpful for all of us, and I'm very conscious of the support this committee provides to defence and how you want the right things to be done. I'm going to speak. I've been given evidence to this committee for 10 years. I'm going to speak plainly and carefully. Don't try and put words in my mouth.
I can understand what you're saying, and people can make their own judgments. So can we come, it's now January, we're getting towards the end of the financial year. What is the current underspend or overspend on Ordell and CDL budgets for each of the armed forces?
So under the new system, and I know you've asked a lot of questions about this, under the new system...
Which the department refuses to answer.
I think you've had answers to the
No,
questions.
they're not
haven't you?
answers.
Oh,
They're
well,
side.
one of the few things that I don't have responsibility for is answering parliamentary questions. So I'll let you pick that up with the Defence Minister when he comes.
Anyway, maybe you can answer it. Yeah.
But under the new model, the funding flows to the military strategic headquarters, to me, and then down through the commands. The total budget for the defence is about 62 billion this year, of which just under 40 billion is for the military strategic headquarters, which includes the 4 commands. There's been no point in the year where that budget has been reduced, apart from some reallocation of funding into defence nuclear. Managing a budget in year is a perfectly normal process.
How much was that went into defence nuclear?
I would have to confirm that precisely with you.
If you would,
several hundred million.
Okay, just for time's sake. Yeah, let's do
and that
it.
was about trying to balance the pressures across defence. And managing, all departments have this issue of trying to, how do you manage the budget to make sure you don't overspend? Departments are not able or allowed to overspend. As I'm sure you know, as we get towards the end of the financial year, departments are asked to identify their forecasts. Then a negotiation goes on with the Treasury to ensure that...
I understand the process. Yeah.
Well,
I'm just trying to find out whether you currently have an underspend or overspend on each of your budgets.
And right now we're in a position where we are forecasting to spend more than the budget we've got. That's the process that's being negotiated.
How much is that currently forecast?
And I'm not going to talk about that in public. Those conversations are happening right now between the accounting officer and ministers and officials in the
Anyway, you
Treasury.
confirmed you are overspent at the moment.
We are not overspent right now. You're not allowed to overspend. What we're saying is the forecast by the end of the year would be that if we carried on and to make no changes, it's a perfectly normal process to go through supplementary estimates, and that's the process that we're going through right now.
The process currently, you do not have enough money to meet what you want to do.
We do not have enough money to do everything that is currently planned. And that is a perfectly normal position, as you would recognise. Happens every year, has happened over the last few years, and the department has been allocated additional funding in supplementary estimates. That process will conclude in the short term.
Yeah. Thank you very much. On to Ian Room.
Chief Marshal, obviously there are lots of items on the list of spending priorities which you have alluded to, the new Type 26 and 31 frigates. But given what you said earlier on that you only advise ministers, can I ask what advice did you give to ministers on the medium helicopter programme?
So the new medium helicopter programme, or new medium helicopter, is nominally a replacement for Puma, which was taken out of service, as you may remember, last year. That is still one of those issues that is in the forward programme, and when the Defence Investment Plan concludes, it will conclude on whether that programme goes forward and at what scale. My position on new medium helicopter is that we have a gap since Puma went out of service, and there is a clear requirement for that. Whether that sits as high up the list of priorities as other things is a matter for the overall Defence Investment Plan, and will ultimately be a matter for ministers. And
where does it sit on your advice and your interpretation? Because obviously you've had lots of experience. Where on that list would the medium helicopter programme sit on your list of priorities as a CDS?
Oh, well, there's a massive programme of investment, and there's a whole bunch of programmes on there. I can tell you it is not as important as nuclear, but it is also not at the bottom of the list either. So it will sit. So it will find its place in the overall defence.
One of the reasons why I ask you this question is because we're on this Defence Select Committee. It's been discussed under an urgent question to ministers this afternoon. So I was wondering if you had a briefing this morning with them to say what their stand should be.
I have not had a discussion about new medium helicopter with ministers this morning or even this year.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. On to Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Defence Staff, you had a meeting with the Prime Minister before Christmas that you just mentioned earlier, and you said that the figures in that meeting were classified. So
all the details of that meeting, all the papers were classified secret.
Thank you. So, yeah, you had a meeting with the Prime Minister before Christmas, the details of which are classified. You define one of your roles as advising ministers, including the Prime Minister. Do you have the sense that current government are going to fund defence fully enough for us to be ready for full-scale combat in the next few years?
What the target is the NATO capability targets, and we know that to deliver the capability targets we need to spend about 3.5% on hard defence. The Prime Minister has stood up and said that in Parliament, and he said it alongside of the leaders in The Hague. Right now, 3.5% investment in defence feels like the right kind of number.
But do you mean the Prime Minister has said that we need to spend that, or he said that we're going to spend that?
Well, the Prime Minister was committed to spend 3.5% on defence. Now,
my question was in the next few years, because obviously that commitment is not in the next few years. So I'm just trying to ask you about kind of really quite in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
And whether your sense and your feeling and your advice to ministers is that they will find the funds to get ready for full-scale combat in the next few years. And of course, bear in mind that if you think the answer is yes, we should hear you say yes.
Yeah. I'll kind of refer you back to my earlier question, early answer to the question. The commitment to spend 2.6% of defence by 2027, and for that to rise in the period beyond that, and the Prime Minister's commitment to 3.5% of GDP, that's unprecedented. But I'll be completely honest with you that we will not be able to do everything that we would wish to do as quickly as we might want to do it within that envelope. But that is a matter for judgment for ministers around the trade-offs that they have to make. My job is to make sure that ministers understand the consequences of whatever is in the programme, and that we spend the money on the things that are going to add the most value and make the most difference.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. On to Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, CDS, for coming in. I draw everyone's attention to my register of interest in relation to training and technology. Can I just understand a little bit further about what you were just saying then, CDS? Obviously, I understand you want to be as helpful as possible to the committee, given the circumstances, and the circumstances are not easy for all kinds of reasons. But I think I heard you say that you were perfectly clear that the government could not fund the combination of current commitments to programmes and the SDR. Something has got to give in some way compared to a level. That might be a level of ambition, it might be pushing stuff to the right, it might be the word we don't use, beginning with cuts, you know, that, as it were. But I think that was what I heard you say. Was that right?
Partially, Mr. Norman. So what the point I'm making is that the SDR set a head mark of 2035, and it would be there will be limitations in terms of capacity of industry. There'll be limitations in our ability to recruit the number of people we need. There'll be limitations financially. My point is we cannot deliver everything we might want to in a very short period. In a very short period of time.
It might I mean, as it were, you can imagine small in-year savings, additional funding. If that remains what it is, you might have to cut a platform. That might be something, that would be a major change required to fund other activities. Is that the kind of thing that's being discussed at the moment?
So there's a whole range of choices that we might have. I laid out some around things like levels of contingency, the speed at which you might do things. There are things that will go out of service and be replaced, and the question is whether we can accelerate that replacement, whether we can bring in new capability, modernise. The First Sea Lord talked recently about this concept of Atlantic Bastion, providing additional capability through autonomous systems. So all of those are in play, Mr. Norman. All of those are things that we
big
can
capital
consider.
programs, but also small in-year and multi-year revenue programs.
Yeah. So what I'm specifically talking about now is the big system. The in-year measures are more where Mr. Twigg was coming from, and Mr. Thomas.
Let me just ask. Obviously, one of our concerns, we published a report on it, is on current readiness.
Yes.
The next 2 or 3 years.
Yes.
So, can you just confirm that all of the services will see an increase in disposable cash flow over the next couple of years that they can spend on improving readiness as a matter of resource funding? You hinted that resource funding was coming under additional pressure, but can you just confirm that every one of those services is going to see an increase in its disposable cash?
Yeah, the increase in the defence budget is quite significant. It's about £11 billion more in 27 than it is this year, and that's in cash terms, and that will flow. A proportion of that will flow to
yes.
MSHQ through me. Exactly that.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you. I just wanted to pick that. Obviously, the government's put a bit of a gag on senior members of the armed forces speaking. Has that been a constraint on you or some of your colleagues?
I haven't felt gagged in any way, shape or form. It's a long-standing requirement for senior people to get permission to authority to speak, to make statements. So tonight I am speaking at the all-party parliamentary group for the armed forces. I have to get my words or bullet points cleared through the system. So it's not being gagged, but it's a normal part of the process.
They've obviously
and it has been true.
It's clear that
it's been true under all. As long as I've been a senior officer, that has been the process we've been through. It's nothing particularly new. In that.
How confident? I mean, on a scale of kind of 0 to 10, 1 to 10, low confidence to high confidence, how confident are you that any units that we deployed in Ukraine would have sufficient equipment, training, rotation schedules to be able to maintain a safe capability there?
So I'm confident we will deploy people to ensure that they are safe. But you'll know, Mr. Norman, there is no such thing as zero risk in operational environments, and it's the job of the military leadership and with the support of ministers in decision making is to judge that level of risk and make sure that the benefits that we get from deployment outweigh any risks that we might have. And you will have heard the Defence Secretary say in Kyiv on Friday that we're committing in this financial year a couple of £100 million to improve
just on equipment, training, rotations. You're feeling pretty confident, very confident.
Yeah, so we won't deploy our armed forces if we're not happy that they're going to be safe, and I'm confident, having been closely involved in the work on the coalition, the willing planning, that we have a means of meeting the requirements that have been set, and this additional funding will reduce the risk that they might face.
I just come back to the other point you raised, which I thought was important, which was in relation to NATO. Obviously, you've got obligations, we have obligations as a nation under NATO, providing specified forces at defined readiness levels, for defined contingencies under NATO command on a timely basis. How confident are you that we are meeting our operational and strategic commitments to SACA in all our various domains?
So, what has happened over the last year or so has been an increase in what that target is. I mean, that's the process that NATO goes through. So what NATO has done over the last few years is develop this, what's called a NATO family of plans, the DDA family of plans. And what that has done is helped specify more precisely what the requirements are for right across NATO, and then they get disaggregated down to each nation. As a consequence of that, we are now being asked to produce more than we were in the past, and we are not at that level yet. That's why we need to increase defence spending. What I can tell you now is that, and I speak to SACA, it sometimes feels like daily, but certainly weekly, about what his requirements are, and he is very happy with the quality and capability of what the UK provides. But I'll be very honest with you, Mr. Norman, we have to do more and do better.
So that's important. So you're not very confident at the moment, but you are hopeful that the track you're on will get some confidence. When do you think that will be?
So my point is not about confidence, my point is that the demand on defence has gone up.
Right. But when are we going to meet those SACA plans that we've discussed?
And we will, well, you will need to be spending the full 3.5% before we can meet the full demand in broad terms. But that process will take a number of years, as has been set out in the strategic
we won't hit
defence
SACA's demands until the early 2030s. So if there's a war before then, we're all in trouble.
The whole, and this is where I think we have to be really careful, because the purpose of NATO is to deter Russia from attacking us. The way we do that is we demonstrate that we are ready to fight and win. There's a heated debate about when Russia might be ready to do something versus NATO. Right now they are fixed in Ukraine. They are taking an enormous number of casualties, over 1.4 million casualties. There's some reports of nearly 400,000 deaths this year. So the risk position changes over time. And our job as a contributing nation is to ensure that our forces are as ready as they can be, and to talk about those in a positive and realistic manner. And that's the balance we have to strike.
I think you're giving us a picture of qualified concern, if I can put it that way, about lack of readiness and upgrade relative to SACA plans over the next 4 or 5 years. That's what I'm kind of hearing.
I think your report, the committee's report on readiness, got it right. There are risks right across NATO. There are risks. We are being asked to produce more, and we will produce more as more funding comes online. And therefore cannot be complacent. We've got to stay focused on those things. But also we should also be realistic about the threat that we face.
Right, but more money earlier to address readiness issues will make a huge difference.
It will make a difference,
Thank
obviously.
You.
Thank you much. On to Derek Trigg.
Yeah, CDS, just after your opinion really on this Defence Medical Services. Now, when I was the Minister in 2006-8, one of my priorities was to sort out the problems with Defence Medical Service. So I have some understanding of the issues, and I think generally both the Defence Medical Service and the NHS kept on top of the issues around the casualties we were getting from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Brilliantly, if I may say. Yeah.
They did a fantastic job. But the NHS was in a much better position then. It was coming out of a very difficult period and starting to get a lot of additional funding and make a lot of improvements. I just wonder, would you have concerns currently? I mean, for instance, if we got twice the level of casualties we had in Iraq and Afghanistan in a future conflict, about the ability of the Defence Medical Service and the NHS to cope with that. And I know there's been exercises, but given the massive pressures now, which was even greater than they were then, I just wonder, do you have concerns about the Defence Medical Services and our ability to treat wounded and casualties?
I think I'd lay out my concerns in two buckets. The first is in the short term, and I know the committee had a closed briefing session on the Defence Medical Services. And in the short term, we have a number of gaps in specialist skills. So like a lot of areas across defence, high demand, highly skilled roles are difficult to fill. cyberspace specialists, engineers, and some in the medical profession. And so the work that the head of the medical services and the head of cyber and specialist operations command is doing around financial retention incentives to improve recruitment, all of those is about how we'd address that. And that's a sort of short-term problem we need to get after. My second wider point is that if we ended up in an all-out conflict under NATO Article 5 and sustained mass casualties, the defence medical system is not set up to do that. It would have to plug into the National Health Service. It's exactly what we saw happen in Ukraine. And some of you may have heard me speak at RUSI just before Christmas, and I was talking about the need for us to think about, at a national level, how we would respond and bring all the levers of government's power and authority together to allow us to do that. And at the moment, we don't have a full plan for how we would do that. Now, I have every confidence, given the way the NHS and the brilliant people in the NHS and in the Defence Medical Services responded historically, that we would do that. But right now, we don't have a complete plan for how we would mobilise the National Health Service in the event of an armed conflict at a NATO Article 5 level. So those are the two things that we need to address.
Do you have any idea when that plan might be in place? And I mean, I'm just trying to get the sense of urgency here, and your concerns, because, it's if one thing that service personnel, if they're going to get wounded or hurt, they want to make sure they've got the best possible health services available to them.
The National Health Service and our Defence Medical Services already work very closely together, and you'll know that quite a lot of, the majority of our specialists actually work inside the National Health Service, even though they're in uniform. So that works well. There's more we need to do
to get to this plan.
Where are we on that? So there's a wider piece of work run by the Cabinet Office, which is about developing our national defence plan and structure, and you would be right. It would be right for you to talk to the Cabinet Office about that. But that is part of their overall plan. And I think that over the next year, 18 months, we'll start to see that evolve and develop.
You have concerns at the moment, they're not there.
So we don't have a holistic national plan for how we would mobilise the National Health Service in times of all-out war in Europe.
Right, thank you. So Richard, I want to bring you back to the changing strategic context, in particular Greenland. You'll be aware that there have been threats made about the future position or status of Greenland, with the US describing it as President Trump describing it as a national security priority. So within that wider context, have you been involved in any contingency planning on your part, given that what could happen with Greenland may end up shattering the NATO alliance?
So it won't come as a major surprise, I suspect, that I have not been involved in plans directly to defend Greenland. What I can tell you is that Greenland is part of Denmark, which is part of the NATO, which is part of our overall NATO area of responsibility. I've heard and seen the reports of what US officials have said about their concern around the security of Greenland, particularly against Russia and China. NATO provides an impeccable security guarantee for all those nations that are part of NATO. The Danish Chief of Defence Staff is bringing together a range of chiefs of defence this afternoon. Unfortunately, I can't go because I'll be talking to the all-party parliamentary group this evening. But we look at it as Greenland is part of NATO, and that's the context in which we see these issues. And ultimately, anything else is a political matter. But from a military perspective, it's part of the overall area of responsibility for NATO.
Okay, I believe Martin wanted to come in here as well.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for coming, Chief Marshal. I just want to pick up the theme that Jesse Norman and now Tan's spoken about. So we have, the family of plans is asking for more. There are higher requirements from NATO. We're talking about more deployments. We're talking about coalition of the willing in Ukraine, perhaps defence of Greenland, not defence of Greenland, but NATO training missions in Greenland. You know, there's some sort of NATO deployment to Greenland. We have ongoing commitments in Estonia. We have agreed to back up Finland effectively. You know, so there are quite a lot of demands on our time, yet the military is getting smaller and there are funding gaps spoken about. So I wonder if I could ask something very specific. In talking about the coalition of the willing, and figures of 7,500 have been bandied about, which is 20,000 when you do the rule of three to have a roulement. Obviously the army's only got about 50,000 deployable. Where specifically is the risk? Because we can't put 2,000 troops with the roulement into Ukraine and not be taking risk somewhere else. So is that risk in Estonia? Or is it that we can't back up Poland? Like what's...
Yeah. It's probably worth me setting out the strategic question and challenge associated with the security guarantees for Ukraine and security guarantees for NATO. This is a conversation that my Chief of Defence colleagues and Sakure and I have had. The agreement that was reached last week in Paris with the Paris Declaration, signed by UK, France and Ukraine, is remarkable. What's even more remarkable actually is the commitment that the US have made to security guarantees. And I don't know if you saw the press conference, but Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner both made very firm commitments, and it's the strongest security guarantee that we've ever provided.
Sorry, forgive me, but where's the risk if we put 20,000 troops into Ukraine?
If I might just describe this to you. So on the one so we have a set of security guarantees for Ukraine, and we also have an existing set of security guarantees for NATO. If it was an entirely zero-sum game, then we would you would clearly see forces taken from one place to go somewhere else. Now, that might affect our ability to respond to crises overseas. It might affect our ability to service the contingency requirements, the readiness requirements for NATO. But Russia right now is fixed in Ukraine. Post a peace deal, we don't quite know what the outcome will be. And we will have to make judgments dynamically about where we put the forces and how we service those various security guarantees, because we can't do all of the things in all the places all of the time. I'm confident in terms of our ability to meet a coalition of the willing requirement, certainly in the short term, because, and it's important, and we may want to come on to this in more detail, but the concept, the principle around the coalition of the willing is that it enables Ukraine to build up its armed forces to be able to deter Russia and defend itself. So it's an enabling force. But part of the way in which we enable Ukraine to do that is we offer a backstop alongside the US offer a backstop, and we offer...
So very quickly, if I may, you say that it's, I mean, you're sort of quite happy that Russia is fixed in Ukraine. You almost say that that's a good thing. I agree with you. I think it is a good thing. But if it's a good thing that Russia's fixed in Ukraine, how is it not a bad thing that we become fixed in Ukraine if we deploy troops there?
It depends on the scale, and it depends on the circumstances and what Russia does. You can make an argument.
Well, what's a safe number?
So as we are in a period of detailed planning, and without the security guarantees having to been signed and been through the political process, it would not be helpful for me to lay that out in public, because anything I say will just make Putin wiser. The Prime Minister, I think, has said and committed to having a vote in Parliament about deployment. And part of that will be a role for me to articulate what those risks are, and for those to be debated and considered both in government and in Parliament. And I'll absolutely commit to do that. But I think right now, before we've got the security guarantees settled, it wouldn't be helpful to speculate about what those numbers might be. But I say I'm confident in the short term that we can meet that requirement.
Thank you. Final quick question. How many soldiers does the Russian Federation have in Ukraine?
So if you look at the numbers, it's about... So actually inside Ukraine or in the region, it's well over 500,000.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Emma Deal.
Thank you very much. Hi, CDS. Just a few quick questions from me. What do you think the likelihood is of Russia agreeing a peace deal that sees NATO members as boots on the ground in Ukraine?
So the short answer is we don't know. There are plenty of evidence to suggest that Russia won't sign up to that. But when I spoke to Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner in Paris last week, they were both optimistic about the ability to get to a deal. I was reading a RUSI article from March over the weekend, which talked about there being no prospect of America signing up to security guarantees in Ukraine, and yet here we are with America signing up to security guarantees in Ukraine. So I think it's hard to be certain what will happen. Clearly, the rhetoric coming out of Russia, coming out of Putin, is that implies that they don't want to do a deal. And I always say that there's one person can stop this war right now, and that would be President Putin. But I would say we have moved on dramatically, and pressure on Russia is increasing as a consequence of the coalition of the willing, the role that the Americans have played, and so we will have to wait and see.
Why do you think other members who are part of the coalition of the willing haven't given any similar security guarantees that UK, France and the US have given?
So they will do, I'm certain of that. The leadership is with the UK and France, and the decision was to make a declaration in Paris and to lead the way, but I'm absolutely certain that other nations will make those commitments, and we have a whole range of those nations represented in the operational headquarters in Paris and fully involved in the planning. You'll recognise that lots of different nations have different legal bases for deploying their forces, and they will need to be settled. But yeah, I'm absolutely certain others will join that.
And of course, CDS, you know as well as I do that a vote in Parliament isn't needed for any of this. It's royal prerogative. So do you envisage that if things are moving quickly, that actually the vote in Parliament will come after any?
That would be entirely a matter for ministers.
Thank you very much. Let's now move on to modernisation and readiness issues with Calvin Bailey.
Chief Marshal, the equipment plan from 2023, which underpins the Defence Investment Plan, had a substantive, and we can talk about this number, £29 billion shortfall, which was the MOD's figures. It's actually a bracket of 7 to 29. NAO said about 16,000, but they're all public, and so we can point to those. NAO was clear that the gap didn't arise as a result of inflation or for external pressures. It arose through different behaviours by top-level budget holders and their different approach to the Defence Investment Plan. So the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy both included full predicted costs where they appeared unaffordable. The Army produced an affordable plan but then accepted risks that capabilities wouldn't meet the government objectives, and the report's quite clear about that, and we tussled over this on the Public Accounts Committee last year. Is the NAO's premise about how the gaps arose something that you agree with or not?
As you know, Mr. Bailey, I'm very familiar with the equipment plan report and the NAO's various reports on it, and the reason why it's a range is it depends on what assumptions that you make. Some of that is about uncertainty in future costs. Some of that is about what you assume in terms of the ongoing upgrade costs, for example. But the basic NAO is got a bunch of smart people, and they are right that depending on what assumptions you make, you can make the cost go up or down. But
okay,
I'm familiar with that.
And I will not try and put words into your mouth, but it's the premise that the approach that came about from the NAO's approach, that the three different service chiefs behaved differently, and therefore there was differences.
No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure you could lay it specifically at a single service.
The NAO said quite specifically that the gaps arise by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force putting unfunded programmes into the programme. That's why there was such variance, and the reason why the Army carries such risk is because they cut their programme out. So it's the premise that behavioural change leads to a divergence in the amount of money.
So it's not a behavioural change thing, because if you can't afford it, then you can't deliver it. And so the Defence and the the Navy and the Air Force, in the way you describe it, will have to make adjustments to their programme if you're going to live within it. And that might be about delay, it might be about reductions in numbers. There's a whole bunch of ways in which you can do that. I don't think. I think where you're going with this is that there's some kind of deep cultural difference of approach between the three services. I'm not sure I share that view.
Okay, well, so that's straight from the NAO report, and the point I'm trying to make is the one that you have just made, that actually there is a need for behavioural change, and that was the point of defence reform. And the point of defence reform is that the single service chiefs should submit into you as Chief of Defence, and it's for you, well, your predecessor should have applied prioritisation across those needs. So that 29 billion shouldn't have been something that arrived as part of the DIP, because your predecessor should have prioritised that and presented that prioritisation to your minister and ultimately to the Prime Minister. So that is a behaviour that defence reform wishes for you to get after. Is that something that you're going to stop?
Just remind me which year the equipment plan you're
2023. It's a 10-year programme. See, we know it's all capital expenditure, so those areas, unless there was some big gee whiz thing that I'm not aware of, that £29 billion would still be in the programme as a deficit.
Or somewhere between 7 and 29.
Or 16 if you take the NAO's figures.
And
what I'm after is, so we know there was 3 different methodologies from the 3 different chiefs to put in unafforded programmes. The chiefs all took different approaches. So defence reform says, we've got this quad, CDS is in charge of the lot, he is going to pull them all together, they're going to work towards him. Is that something that you're going to
that's exactly right. So the benefit and opportunity that comes, one of the many benefits and opportunity comes with defence reform, is the ability to pull together a single integrated force plan that I as CDS am ultimately accountable for. And through doing that, we'll apply consistency in terms of the approach that we take. It doesn't necessarily mean that the risk disappears, because you still have to develop a programme as best you can with the best information you have, and things change. And that's, I talked about contingency earlier. The level of contingency we put in allows you to buy out some of those risks. But you're absolutely right. The defence reform model offers us the opportunity, with the money and tasking flowing through the CDS into the single services, to make that a more coherent and systematic approach.
Got it. So if that is the case, and that we require all the services to submit costed programmes on a common basis with no uncosted options, and to force explicit trade-offs between the services before it reaches the ministers, why have we got an uncosted SDR?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to just explain that to me in a bit more
So
detail.
The logic is that prior to it arriving at ministers, the single service chief's behaviour should be to submit costed and affordable profiles ahead of it coming to ministers.
Yeah, so
why are we in the situation that
a couple
we're
of
in?
things. So firstly, the SDR was an external report. It wasn't done by anybody inside the department. And secondly, the SDR did not go into the details around the programme. That's what the Defence Investment Plan is for, and that's the approach that we're trying to take with the Defence Investment Plan, is to make sure that we understand the costs associated with it and the trade-offs and the risks that we're taking.
Okay, and that is entirely in line with the evidence that we've received here at the committee. Lord Robertson came before us prior to the SDR and said that reprioritisation of roles, capabilities, activities and support may be made in terms of the current defence programme, which implies that there should be down arrows and that we should expect to see things stop. However, after the SDR happened, General Barrons came in and was quite Cockshaw and Cock-a-Hoop about the fact that he had not been asked, or they had not been asked, to do prioritisation. So at some point, a decision had been made to remove prioritisation that kind of undermines the whole point, or the premise that I think we agreed on, was that shouldn't have occurred.
As I say, the SDR was an external document. It was presented to the department by the external reviewers, and they were not asked to produce a costed programme. And that's why, one of the reasons why getting the Defence Investment Plan is so hard, because we've got high levels of ambition over long periods of time that we are trying to address and do some of that prioritisation you described.
Okay, so you would accept, therefore, without putting words in your mouth, that the SDR failed to impose prioritisation and therefore allowed that £7 to £29 billion gap and associated commitment pressure to flow straight through to the Defence Investment Plan?
There's a couple of things to reflect on. So firstly, that 2023 equipment plan was based on the previous budget. That was before the uplift to 2.6% in 27 and the commitment to grow beyond that. So that number will have changed. Second thing is that the SDR, as we've both agreed, whilst it did lay out priorities for improvement and modernisation and for filling in hollowness that it reflected on, it did not give us specific areas in which we should disinvest or seek to slow down investment, and that's the work that we have to do through the Defence Investment Plan.
Okay, so there was activity and not prioritisation. I understand there is an amount of sensitivity about this, but I have to ask, what are the down arrows? Where are the capabilities, activities or support functions that could be reduced to support or do the things that the SDR failed to do, which is prioritise?
I recognise why you and the committee will be interested in the detail of that, but I am not going to go into the details of the options that we're considering.
I accept that, but I am here to ask.
I can understand why you asked, Mr.
Indeed.
Bailey. Absolutely.
With that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Jesse Norman, I believe, wanted
Thanks
to
very
comment
much. I just wanted to pick up one of the things you'd said there, CDS, which is that the SDR was an external document presented to the department. Well, we've had Lord Robertson in front of the committee saying specifically that they worked very closely with MOD officials and with the Treasury all the way through, and that there was specific care taken. There should be no surprises as to the costing. So it just feels like a disavowal for you now to say, well, there we were going along, and these suddenly external reports gets presented to us, and we've got to deal with it. How does that work?
I think both things can be true. I mean, Lord Robertson presented the report with their 62 recommendations, 62 recommendations, which were their recommendations to the department. The department, the Defence Secretary, did accept every single one of those recommendations and said we would get on with implementing them. That's exactly what.
So accepted that these were proposals that were costed and accepted for purposes of procedure, planning, programming, and to move forward on that basis. So to come now and have us say, well, hold on a second, we had no idea the SDR was going to create all this additional cost, feels.
That's not at all what.
Well, obviously the Prime Minister thought it was true. So how does that?
That's not what I'm saying. So my point is that if you look back in the history of these things, when we've done a integrated review in 2021, if we did SDSR in 2015, 2010, they were done internally, and the policy document was published alongside, or was done alongside, the detailed investment plan costings. That was not the way that was done this time. The government decided to have an external panel that engaged brilliantly with those of us inside the department, but what has had to follow is the detailed costing of that plan, and that's the work that we are doing under the Defence Investment Plan. That was very specifically what ministers set out that they were going to do.
It was never actually costed. They did some work, they thought it was costed, but it wasn't really costed.
We had not done all of the detail that we are doing right now to make that work, and that was a position that the government decided it was the approach it wanted to take by having the independent review first and then doing the detailed costed plan to follow.
Thank you very much.
I believe Kevin Bailey wanted to come back on this particular point.
Chief Marshal, just to come back on that, whose decision was it to take that out of the terms and references from the SDR? Where exactly in the department? So prior to the SDR, it's in there. PM says make it costed, make it apply prioritisation, fix the problems, and at some point, Defence said, "No, it's all right, we'll do that."
No.
If
you go right back to the start of the process, the Defence Secretary agreed with the Prime Minister that we would have a strategic defence review. Note, strategic defence review, not a strategic defence and security review, and that the job of that team was to develop proposals for how we would improve and modernise defence. They did not ask them to do the detailed planning. That's why in that document it talks about the Defence Investment Plan. If you go back to I think the terms of reference are a matter of public record.
And that's contrary to the evidence that we've received. Lord Robertson was quite clear when he came before us prior to the SDR that the prioritisation would be part of the SDR. By the time the SDR came out, they were very explicit that actually Defence had said it would take the prioritisation, which is why we're expecting the Defence Investment Plan to do that prioritisation, and why I've got this big question about what on earth defence reform means if prioritisation is going to come in terms of Defence Investment Plan. It's not going to come from the Chief, like if it hadn't already got there.
The Defence Investment Plan and the decisions around investments that go into it will be a matter for ministers to decide based on advice on prioritisation that I and others will give to ministers. The point that you're making about Lord Robertson's perspective, I'm afraid that's not one that I recognise, and I'd have to go and talk to Lord Robertson about exactly what he means. I'm not aware at any point, and bear in mind I was Chief of the Air Staff at the time, I'm not aware at any point where the direction to the review team, the independent review team, was changed to ask them to take out prioritisation. I'm not aware of that.
Right, thank you very much. On to Ian, please.
Just a quick supplementary question. Chief Marshal, just before Christmas I asked on the floor to the Secretary of State when the Defence Investment Plan was going to be published, and he said with great urgency, hopefully by the end of the year. That was after the delay in August, and then obviously it's moved to March. So given what you've been saying to Mr Bailey and Jesse here, what's the learning curve for going in the future? What can we learn from this? Because obviously you've got a great handle on this. What lessons can be learned? Because it's like what your mother used to say: if you can't afford it, don't spend it. and what I'm trying to say is, what can we learn from this with the SDR and the DIP? Shouldn't there just be one document? It
will be a matter for whichever government then initiates my experience has been that turning policy ambition into hard costed capability plans is really difficult, and if you can try to do those two things together, then you can make those trade-offs as you go through. But I would also observe the advantages that we had in terms of speed and different perspectives by having an independent panel conduct the strategic defence review. So some kind of blend of that in the future might be a sensible way forward. But I'm quite a student of these defence reviews, and what you can see is that they are very, very context dependent. It depends on what's going on in the world at the time. It depends on who the government is, whether there's just been an election. All of those things play a part in it.
I can't wait to read your paper on it in 5 years' time.
Right, thank you very much. On to Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. CDS, I'm going to ask about reserves, the reserve force, another thing which was laid out in the SDR with some lofty ambitions, including an increase of 20% in time. In the context of the conversations we've been having about some of the challenges of funding some of the strategic aims the government have put forward, and also the increasing threat, I want to ask you about the near term again, so I really don't want to get into the 2030s. How seriously is the MOD taking reforming the reserves? And we've had various review documents of the reserves in the last few years that you'll be familiar with, and yet numbers are falling, and the real estate that certainly the Army Reserve has is kind of noted to be further deteriorating. Can you just give us a sense of, with a bit of kind of your own take, now you're in this role, of like how important do you see the reserve force or not?
So on your final point, the reserve is a fundamental component of the whole force.
Just why is that? Because I personally transferred from the regular force to the reserves, as did other members. I've noticed that does not seem to be the case. So when you say that, when you say it's a fundamental part of the force, like what do you mean by that? Because it doesn't appear to be.
So if you go to RAF Witten, which is actually a Cyber and Special Operation Command unit.
Where we're going next week as a committee.
Well, there we go. You'll see when you, well, particularly if you go to weekends, you'll see that the reserves are critical to continuing to sustain and maintain the intelligence work of that unit over those quiet hours. I was there just before Christmas. I used the place for special communications, and I know that there were reservists supporting the outputs then. So I think the reserve do a number of things. In terms of delivering our outputs, they do that day in, day out, particularly specialists. And I would point to people like those who are at Witten, who are intelligence specialists, who are able to provide additional capacity, particularly at weekends, to do that. And there are specialist skills that are much more readily available in the private sector that are hard to sustain and retain inside the armed forces that we use. And intelligence, cyber are particular examples of that. Medical is another area. And so the reserves play a really critical part in those specialist skills. More broadly, though, as we think about how are we going to mobilise all of the armed forces in a state of rising tension and ultimately up to Article 5, that's where we build mass and capacity and capability through the reserves. And I would absolutely recognise, and Lord Peach wrote his external review of reserves, which the report we received just before Christmas. And it's not at the level we would want it to be, either in terms of the strength of the armed force, of the reserve forces, or necessarily in terms of the infrastructure and kit that they get access to.
So given what you just said about how integral a part of the overall force it is, in the document you referenced by Lord Peach, which is the Council of Reserve Forces and Cadets Association's Annual Statutory Report 2025, the kind of RIFCA scrutiny report, the number one top finding, based on the fact that all the numbers of strength is down, every single one of them, so fewer people are joining, even the strategic vision is more of them joining. Right. The number one finding is this: the reserve lacks a clear and resourced sense of purpose, which they don't know why they're there. They don't know why they exist. And I take your point about niche specialists here and there, vital, amazing. And I think probably this committee has had time spent with other parts of the force where that being enhanced has been spoken about, and we all support that. But this overall part, it feels like the reserve force is extremely fragmented, poorly resourced, struggles to retain people, clearly is struggling to recruit people. Do you think it's ready to reform it, or do you think it works at the moment with this separate kind of reserve force HQs?
So my personal view is that we have to integrate the reserves much more closely into the way in which the forces operate. My experience at Air Command, for example, was that we integrated the reserves into the headquarters at Air Command and have actually now docked them under a regular commander as AOC 2 group. I think that model works well in certainly in the Air Force and to some extent the Navy. The Army have more formed units from reserves, and there is perhaps a different model. But my core guiding principle for the reserves, which I think should get at your concern, Mr Thomas, is they have to be part of the plan. We have to be clear what the reserves are going to do and when, and that shapes how they train, how we equip them, and that gives that clear sense of purpose to our reserves. And I admit we are not there yet. The SDS are committed to improving the size, the resourcing, both financially and in equipment terms. And all of that will be something we'll have to improve over the next few years to make sure that we get the most out of the reserve, which we spend a significant amount on every year.
Yeah, it's not cheap. Can I ask you, and that's actually really good to hear, acknowledgement that there's some work to go.
Definitely.
And I very personally endorse that model of having them much more closely integrated with regular units, because otherwise they kind of, you get that lack of sense of purpose. Last question on the reserves. We've been around NATO partners, we've travelled a bit as a committee, and other countries view their what you might call a kind of third-tier echelon force or a kind of defence force, or what the Estonians call the EDL, which is the Estonian Defence League, I think. Our equivalent would be what we call the strategic reserve, so people who've maybe served in the military but are no longer reservists, and they're kind of quite a few years out from ever having been near uniform or a rifle or anything like that. What's your personal take on if we did get into a full-scale conflict, whether you trust those people, whether they be part of the plan? Are they part of the plan?
So the SDR lays this out, actually, that says the strategic reserve is an important part of that wider resilience through our armed forces. I am really confident that if we found ourselves in that rising level of crisis, those who had served previously, had retired and gone out and to do some, or gone into another area of, or another profession, or into the private sector, I am sure that many of them would want to come back. What we don't have right now is an effective system of tracking and engaging that community, and that's part of the work on the reserve development that Minister for Veterans and People wants to deliver as part of the SDR deliverables. And I think that will be an important part of our overall level of resilience. And I'll be completely honest, we don't have a good plan right now to do that.
Okay, well, thank you for your honesty with that. I'm going to move on to a separate area now, away from reserves. So to speak about defence reform.
Yeah.
We had your predecessor in front of this committee twice, I think. Once shortly before he was due to go. He then finished and made a speech, his first appearance in public since leaving the role, and you kind of never quite know what people are going to say once they're no longer not shackled, but you know what I mean. They're free to speep.
Not gagged.
Gagged, that was the word I was looking for, yeah. What he said was that he tried very hard to change culture in the MOD and in the forces, and that he couldn't. And that it was kind of really, really tough to change culture. Part of defence reform vision that we've heard is around culture, and that kind of culture of attitudes to women and minorities in the forces, or it could be culture in terms of risk aversion in procurement, or it could be any number of things. I want to ask you specifically about the risk aversion in procurement. Which is something that multiple people in defence have spoken to us about. And this basically is that for civil servants and uniformed people making decisions about what to trial and eventually procure, there's really no incentive to take risk, because you're liable to be sued by defence companies, and you're putting your career on the line. So culturally leads to a situation of stasis. And that, that's not your words, but that's what I've heard from a lot of people. Do you have any plans to try and shift that culture?
The short answer is yes, we have to. It's not a matter of do we want to, we have to. And particularly because of speed and speed of adaptation. I've been out to Ukraine 3 times in the time I've been CDS. And one of the things that is really plain when you go to visit is how everybody through the system has a clear understanding of the requirement, the threat, the need to do something, and is able and willing to balance that need with the risk that they're able to take. So I'm on record as saying that what we have done in defence over the last 30, 40 years is optimise a system for driving cost out. And we've optimised it for the 20th century, not necessarily for the 21st century. That's led to highly transactional relationships with industry, where we have tried to lay off risk on industry, and industry has tried to protect itself from that risk. And that was at a time when we weren't facing a threat from Russia. We wouldn't face the need to change as quickly, and that is not going to be adequate for the future. I don't think it's fair to say that throughout the whole of defence procurement system no risk is taken. If that were true, then we wouldn't necessarily have some of the challenges we have in
I don't think I said that, to be fair.
in a number of areas. And I think that how this works in Ukraine and in other nations that face these existential threats, and how it worked in the UK, if you read about what we did during the Second World War, is a real clarity around the need to change and a delegation of an empowerment of people to make those trade-offs between the risks that you face, whether that be in procurement terms or maybe even in assurance, versus the benefit that you get from delivery. And it's about creating that environment to do that. So you would have seen in the SDR, and I think Rupert talked about it when he came before the committee previously, this idea of segmenting procurement.
I will just quote him because we have heard in some detail from, as you say, from Mr. Pearce, who's the new National Armaments Director, about segmentation and the staff who were with him. But my last question to you, and it's interesting you mentioned that previous panel we had with the new National Armaments Director. One of the questions I asked them was, culturally, the direction in the MOD, is it to prepare for some kind of future conflict that might happen in the 30s, as in 2035, which is one of the dates that we've currently committed to hit certain funding categories, which is it's so far away that it's, policy can change so much between now and then. Or is it to get ready to fight and win in the next couple of years? If Russia's fixed in Ukraine at the moment, if there is a ceasefire this year and discussions for deals are well underway now, then it might shift its gaze and we might be drawn into conflict, and suddenly conversations about spending X, Y, Z in 2035 seem a bit far-fetched, or rather irrelevant. I asked them, and they told me, ask CDS when he comes to funding. So that's what they said on record. This is what I said.
I read it.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
So perhaps slightly obvious answer is you have to do both. So I talk about being ready to fight today and tomorrow and together. The today bit is about how do we maximise the output that we can get from the kit we've got today, and that's about investing in spares, it's about investing in activity, and at the same time we also have to recognise that our enemy is changing, is adapting, and we need to be able to keep up with that. So you have to kind of do both. What the defence reform does, partly to Mr. Bailey's point, is it provides much greater clarity over the problem statement coming from the military, and much greater delegation to the National Armament Director to go to industry to work out how best to solve that. And if that works, what that delivers is a faster response to specific problems that we face. And we've got good examples of where we did this. If you think about the counter IED fight in Afghanistan, when Mr. Joppa and I worked together previously, actually we did that remarkably well. And it was because we had a very clear threat and a very clear requirement to do better. And that's the culture that we've got to bring in. But I'll be honest with you, it is difficult. If you take somebody like me, I've spent 30 plus years in the armed forces, and we've been doing it the same way that whole time. To shift that mindset requires real clarity over the requirement, the threat, and then delegating and empowering our people to do those things. And when things go wrong, because they might do if you take more risk, is we acknowledge they've gone wrong and we say it was in the greater good, and I may be using that defence in front of the committee at some point.
Well, you're welcome to. You would be welcome to in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Lincoln Jopp wanted to come in on this point as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. I think we probably had a pretty similar briefing when the committee went to Ukraine. And what was so telling was the way in which they had completely bypassed a load of stuff in order to get the responsiveness to the ever-evolving threat. And if we looked at what they had cut out, and they'd effectively cut out the whole of the military chain of command above brigade level, they'd cut out the whole of the Ministry of Defence, and they'd cut out every single regulator. Now, if you want the responsiveness that you're talking about, institutions get the behaviours they reward. And you just said, you spent 30 years in the armed forces doing it in one way, which you've now acknowledged should be wrong. But the institutions get the behaviours that they reward, and they rewarded you with becoming CDS. And so, how are you going to meet this challenge? But you've grown up and been successful in a system that you now have to say, we completely need to change that wholesale, and I'm the man to lead it.
So I think the point I'm trying to make is that that is a part of the acquisition system, which under the new model is the National Armament Director. What I can do as the head of the armed forces in this new model is be super clear about what the specific problem statements and requirements are, and be prepared to accept that we won't, in this new model, drive towards precise requirements 20 years in the future, but instead focus on what are we going to be able to deliver this year, next year, or this week, next week, and the week after. And that's the model that defence reform is trying to bring into place. What that will require is changes in regulation, changes in process, and it will require us to accept failure when it occurs, and to acknowledge that that was in pursuit of the greater good. And what gives me some confidence around this is that when we look at those circumstances where we have had that very clear requirement, we have swept away some of that process. We've swept away some of that regulation that has accreted and built up over 25, 30 years of the peace dividend. And I'm not in any way pretending that is easy, and I'm not in any way pretending that we can be complacent and it will naturally just happen. But I think we've seen the importance of it in Ukraine, and we've seen an example of how it can be done in Ukraine. And let's be honest, the Ukrainian system is not without its flaws or problems as well. And right now we're not at war, and that the challenge is how do we create that sense of urgency without creating this sense of panic and throwing all of the regulations that are established by this place out of the window, and that will be a consistent effort to carve that away over time.
Thank you. Mike Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if you might touch on homeland preparedness and resilience. See, I mean, you'll know very well, NATO Article 3 mandates that we should continuously, I'm just quoting, and effectively maintain and develop our individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. And that specifically, speaks to this question of national resilience, both in a military sense and in a non-military sense as well. How would you say we're doing on that?
Not as well as I would want us to. I mean, that was really the central element of my speech at RUSI, is that we, those of us in this community, are familiar with the issues and risks, and we talk about it all the time. But it is not at the front of our minds right across the nation. And the example I gave in my RUSI speech was a report, really excellent report done by the Royal Academy of Engineering about infrastructure and about the need to rebuild infrastructure around things like flood defences, railways, etc. And I could agree with all of the elements in there, but at no point did it talk about doing it to build in resilience for the risk that we might come with armed attack or sabotage. And so we have to bring those things more to the fore. The Cabinet, following the publication of the National Security Strategy and the SDR, the Cabinet Office lead across government work to enhance these this thinking in these areas and to deliver those things. but this isn't free and isn't going to happen overnight. And I judge, and I've argued, that this, in a world where the demands on defence and the nation are rising, the risks are rising, that is a time when we should be contemplating and examining how we increase the resilience of the nation more broadly. So as we think about upgrading signalling on railways, is how do we build in the redundancy associated with that? We talked about the National Health Service earlier. How do we think about holding stockpiles or building capacity and resilience to support us in mass casualty events? And that work is really relatively new and really getting going. And I know that the team in the Cabinet Office have said that they would be very happy to come and talk to the committee about it if that were helpful.
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely about, is that bridge built to do X under duress? And there's a mindset shift as well. So I'm an MP for a constituency that suffered repeated water outages, including a 2-week one before Christmas. And towards the end of that, we had bad actors playing in the social media space around the water quality. So actually, you're a water company, you think your job is to supply water, but all of a sudden you're dealing with malicious disinformation. And we did actually have to ask the Cabinet Office to get involved there. And I agree with you that stuff costs money, but plans are cheap. So do we have a national defence plan?
We don't have a complete national defence plan
Shouldn't
yet.
we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the government is committed to doing that.
Why don't we have one?
So I think that it is a manifestation of the peace dividend. It's one of the most obvious, is that since the end of the Cold War, we have not prioritised those matters, and so as a consequence, the government for many years has not, of many hues, has not focused its efforts on developing that kind of plan. I'm pleased to say that partly as a consequence of what's in the Strategic Defence Review, that is changing. And
when are we going to have the plan?
So I would say that you will. The complete national defence plan, that is a question for Cabinet Office.
As we're mandated to do, right? We signed a treaty.
Inside defence, which is a component of it, we have a plan called Op Arculus, which is forms the basis of our national defence plan, and we will evolve and develop that over this year, and it will be an ongoing thing. But we will have a plan that I can point to where I understand the command and control arrangements, I understand how we will transition through war through this year.
And are you aware of any other NATO countries that don't have national defence plans?
There are a number. I don't know the exact which nations, and some nations don't talk about it in public. And I think it's fair to say that nations may describe themselves as having a national defence plan, but they're of variable depth of detail across all of those different nations. Our job should be to focus on us and making sure we have the plan.
Would you say that it's sort of letting the side down to not have one?
I think, as you said yourself, NATO expects us to have a national defence plan, and that's why we need to work on it and build it.
Thank you very much. On to Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Marshal, it's a delight to have you in front of us. I want to talk to you a bit about defence reform, which you've obviously already picked up a bit on in some of the previous answers, but I just want to give you an opportunity to sort of put on the record how defence reform is going. You've had the programme underway for a year now. How are the new structures enabling you to deliver outcomes, and what difference does it make having the service chiefs reporting directly to you?
Please. As the SDR said, defence reform is the work of a whole Parliament, but our initial structures are in place with the CDS, the National Armoured Director, Permanent Secretary, and the Chief of Defence Nuclear, and our responsibilities and accountabilities are clear. The underpinning processes, alignments of budgets, particularly the establishment of the portfolios of acquisition and how they are organised and what they face off to, that work is still ongoing. The 1st of April 26 is the key date that we've set ourselves, but there will continue to need to be evolution of the systems over the subsequent years. In terms of how it's helping, I think that if you look at the way in which the COS committee has been operating, Chief of Staff committee has been operating, we spend more time together now. I think the conversations are at a more strategic level and are focused on building, a lot of it has been focused on the integrated force plan and how that will fit inside the defence investment plan. So I think that those are positive changes.
Have
but
you
ultimately,
got any clear-cut examples of how it's really tangibly made a difference so far?
So I think I'd say the most obvious are when I talk to my ops people, and the clarity that comes with an element of that group being responsible for policy and another element responsible for military strategy is provide really clear choices and sharper divide or brought into sharper focus the choices that we're offering to ministers. And I think when you talk to my folks as part of that organisation and the permanent secretaries folks, they would point to those opportunities, and it's allowed us to spend more time talking about military strategy and how that fits together and nest that within the policy. But I think ultimately the big question will be, can we drive the pace that Mr. Job talks about? Can we ensure that we deliver cost effectively against those set of requirements? And that will take some time. The other thing I would want to emphasise is that whilst we talk about clarity of responsibility across the 4 pillars, I'm really clear that we don't deliver for the country or defence unless we work together. So if we think about exports, for example, the National Armament Director isn't going to sell very much if the armed forces aren't prepared to go and spend time with the other nations to describe how we use them. And so it's the collective responsibility that will deliver the overall outcome, but the clarity over those requirements and the sharper dividing line makes it easier for us to understand how our performance is, how we are performing. And so, for example, I now undertake quarterly reviews with the commands and their people about what it is we're asking them to do, how they're getting on with it, and how head office and how the other parts of defence can support them to deliver. That was not a thing that happened previously, and I hope ultimately that will enable us to deliver more for defence.
Thank you. We will continue to ask this question every year, and so hopefully we'll come back with more and more tangible examples of greatly improved pace and value for money, etc. I want to actually just pick up on, I know when my colleague Calvin Bailey was asking you about, you and the chiefs all being on the same page. I mean, for me, it was obviously really clear that you obviously set the demand signal, and they report into you, and that you are, you've said you are on the same page. But I think, it was quite interesting to see at DSCI, the chiefs going on the, being given speaking slots, seeing everybody, sort of taking their opportunity to put their pitch in for why their, work was important. How confident are you that you can genuinely exercise this central authority? If the chiefs are continuing to be able to sort of go out and brief out their pitch, basically.
I want the chiefs to be talking about their specialist domain. I want Harv to talk about the air domain, and Gwyn to talk about maritime, and Rowley to talk about land, and Jim to talk about cyber and specialist operations. I want them to do that. They are the experts in their domains. They have a really important role to play. But you can understand that what we have to do is try to integrate those things to create an integrated force. And the really significant change with defence reform is that the tasking and the money flows through the CDS in a way that it hasn't done in the past, and that provides us with the opportunity to do that. But until we get the defence budget and the defence plan in balance, then it's going to be difficult for us to really make inroads, and that's why the defence investment plan is so important.
So I come from the private sector, and so I am really getting to know how the MOD works in a way I just didn't before. And in the private sector, when a business commits to a process of change, generally, in my experience, what happens is, the business brings in people who really specialise in transformation, in change, in, specifically finance. You've got a team of, highly competent people running defence reform, but they are people, from what I can see, with military backgrounds, not necessarily with that specialist knowledge. Is there a different way of doing this?
So just to be clear, that the head of the transformation programme has come from outside defence. Gaby has. She has a mixed team inside working for her, which does include some small number of military officers and civil servants, but also she has specialist help from a range of external assistance from consultants with specific expertise in this, and they've been brought in deliberately to do the things that you describe.
Right. But I mean, it's good to hear that there are some of those skills being brought in-house. I mean, I think it is important, to have them in-house rather than, consultants, telling you from sort of externally. Is there scope for more of that, more specialism being brought in from outside to drive change?
The government's been very clear that it doesn't want to spend more money on consultancy and external assistance, but also recognises there are some areas where there is limited expertise inside the organisation, and in those specific cases, then yes, we will bring people in from outside.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got just under 25 minutes, so there's still a lot of ground to cover. So my request to members and to your good self, Chief of Defence Staff, is that our questioning and answers are as concise as possible, starting off with Lincoln Job.
Thanks, Chair. You said in response to Alex's question that you think that as a result of defence reform, the building is better at doing military strategy.
No, I said we had more time to spend focused on military strategy, which keep going, sorry.
On, I think, around June 1943, one of your predecessors, Field Marshal Allenbrook, wrote in his diary that he was, the thing that was really vexing him was how did he beat Germany in such a way that it could regrow Germany to act as a counterbalance to Russia in the post-war conflict, long before, obviously, Normandy and the whole of that was happening. So what are you metaphorically or literally writing in your diary tonight?
So I don't write a diary. I don't have the time to do that. And I'm always amazed at what Allenbrook was able to do with the pressure that he was under. I think the thing that I am most bothered about in the near term is Russia, and how we get ourselves to a position where Russia concludes that they will not attack NATO or therefore undermine our national security, but also at the same time recognising that in holding conflict below the threshold, that there will inevitably be Russian activity below the threshold of war. And in doing that, what we need to work is how do we work across all of the agencies, all of the levers of government to protect UK from that risk. More broadly beyond that is that there's a changing shape and direction of source of power right across the globe. You can see it moving eastwards, and that's even before we talk about changes in US national security policy and strategy and how we bring those together. And therefore the question is, what is the role of the UK, and particularly the armed forces in the UK, to enable the stability and security that we've enjoyed over 80 years, and how that has enabled prosperity and ultimately growth for the nation, which is a key challenge for us. So that's the big questions I think we have to wrestle with. And we have an opportunity to do that sometimes now, which I'm not sure we always did in such a structured way before.
Right. Thank you very much. On to Emily.
Thank you. The defence world tends to not be great at conveying simple and straightforward messages to the public. You've spoken about having a national conversation about the risks that we face. Obviously, people in this room are aware of those risks, but how are you going to reach out to the wider population, have that national conversation?
Yeah. So I think armed forces and leaders in the armed forces particularly, but also right through our ranks, have a role to play in that. As I set out in my recent speech, the challenge is how do you have a conversation about a complex threat that sits within a wider geopolitical and geostrategic context that is uncertain and challenging. Because the danger is you fall back on simple tropes that Russia's going to invade by 27 or they're not going to invade by till 2035. And the reality is it's actually a matter of a judgment around the level of risk that we face. My core argument is that what we are seeing is an increasing risk as our adversary in Russia particularly becomes more capable, more battle-hardened, and we see a continued desire to undermine NATO and the stability of the West and the rules-based international system. And we should have those kind of debates in public. I think the polity have a critical role to play in that, and we can support that because of our understanding of the threats. But the role that our reserves play, the role our cadets play, the role that our regular services play in talking about what the armed forces do, I think is an important part of that national conversation.
I mean, just even listening to you there, CDS, if I was someone watching this and trying to understand what the risks are, I would have been lost off. Do you know, just the average person on the street, if we're going to try and get them to understand what the risk is, don't we need to be a bit more blunt and slightly more alarmist with them so that they understand it? Because like you said, people are living in a cosy bubble of the peace dividend, and actually that's not where we're at anymore. But I think every single time I hear anybody in defence talking about it, I think the average person will be lost off within 5 seconds and just get on with their day. It's about making sure that they actually understand, and I don't think the public are there yet. And if the public aren't there yet, then how are we going to get them to be resilient?
Yeah, I think it's a really fair challenge, and you as politicians, it's your job to communicate with society. My worry about being too blunt is that we scaremonger. My worry about being too relaxed is we're too complacent. And the reality is it's more complicated than that. And I would be happy to take advice from politicians on how to do that in an effective way. But I think if we are too alarmist, that is unnecessary. But equally, we can't be complacent either.
I mean, you'll be aware, CDS, that other countries, so just looking at Norway and Finland have had military conscription for decades. I've got friends in Finland, and they'll talk quite openly about how, you know, they're always ready. Basically, they know that that's something as a nation they have to do. The Swedish government has their total defence strategy. Other governments send out booklets to their citizens to say this is what you would do in the event of a national attack or an attack on civil critical national infrastructure. There is nothing like that in the UK, not even the basics to let people know if this happens, this is what you need to do. I could go out now and ask anyone and say, what would you do in the event of an attack? And there would just be mass panic. So what can we do to avert that, I suppose what I'm saying.
I spoke recently about the Swedish model where they have, I think it's annually, but certainly regularly provide a booklet that goes out in Swedish, simple Swedish and English, and it talks about some of these issues. Some of it is about straightforward national resilience, so I suspect Mr Martin's constituents and the problems they had with water supply would cover off those things, but it also expands right the way out to armed attack. And it feels to me that those are the sorts of things that would be part of that wider national conversation. And they can be reassuring as well as realistic about the potential threats that we face. But it seems to me that we have to start with a description of what those things might be, admit that there's a degree of uncertainty about the likelihood of it happening, and then to use all of the means available to help educate society more broadly on what we might do. But it goes beyond straightforwardly thinking about whether you're going to store drinking water at home. It is about how do we encourage people to want to serve? How do we have the conversation with public that says we are going to spend more money on defence, and that will have consequences. And ultimately, I think that is a political discussion, but we can help support that through a description of the threats.
And I think that's one of the central dilemmas, is the public don't accept more spending on defence because they're not fully aware of what the risk is, and that's something we're always battling with as members of Parliament. And until we get something clearly out there in an understandable format to the public, they're never going to accept that. Just another quick question from myself, Chair. The Defence Readiness Bill, do you know when that will be ready?
I don't. My understanding is that it depends on finding parliamentary time for it, and I know it's a key focus for Defence Readiness and Industry, MIN-DRA, Luke Pollard and the Defence Secretary, and they're determined to try and get it in during this Parliament, but I don't have a precise date.
Do you have any part to play in advising ministers what should be in that bill?
Yes, we will do. Yes, there'll be the military staffs will have a part to play in that, and describing some of the issues that we want. And clearly, it will require specialist drafters, because we don't often do bills in defence.
What do you think should be in it?
So, a range of things, but it will be about how do we government gain access to private assets in times of crisis? How do we shift industrial capacity to particular areas of focus in times of crisis, and mirroring laws and responsibility, laws and rights that other governments have in other nations. The US is an example. So elements of those will be what we would need.
Okay. Thank you very much. On to Ian Rowe.
Right, thank you very much. Well, the time wraps here, so I'll be very quick. Air Chief Marshal, you mentioned at Russia, your speech on the 15th of December, that people are a critical role. In fact, the Rick Haythwaite also said that people are a pivotal military capability just as much as a new submarine or fast jet. You also said a pleasing thing that this committee is, when we've had General McGowan in front of us, and we've had the Secretary of State, and also General Dame Sharon Neesmith come in front of this committee about the retention. And one thing shocked me, obviously, from the last reports that we heard, that we had more people exiting than actually being recruited. You said in that speech, the latest figures just a few weeks ago, which had been then beginning of January, showed that the first time in 4 years more people joined than left the forces in the past year, which I think is a big achievement. So coming on to the wider broadness of the question is, can you give the committee an update on the Haythwaite, the Haythwaite review, and your assessment of where the armed forces are in relation to recruitment and retention? Because I do know that we've had briefings about the pinch points, and those also where we've had to have given bonuses, which at the time one of our questions was, is this just sticking plasters? Because, particularly around your trade, which engineering.
I mean, on the macro points, up to the 1st of October 25, which is the last time we had up-to-date data, more people had joined in the previous 12 months than had left. We've seen increases in those recruited. The Air Force was up to 37%. I think the Navy was about 24% increases in numbers of recruits, and we've seen a reduction in the number of people leaving. So I take all of those things as positive, but the net increase was only a few hundred over that year, and it needs to be bigger to fill in the gaps that have been created over the last few years where exits have exceeded inflow. There's a whole bunch of factors that will have played a part in that. Some of it is the financial retention incentives, some of it will be the pay rises, some of it will be the for example, the defence housing strategy. Some of it is about greater flexibility, allowing our personnel to extend their services who want to. All of those add up to delivering the shift in position that you've described. I actually saw Rick Haythorne-Thwaite last week to catch up with him because I was involved in his report. And effectively, his recommendations form the basis of the chapter in the Strategic Defence Review on people, and that is what we're driving at. You'll recall that Rick's report had, I think, 62 recommendations. That's a lot to get our arms around, so trying to focus the work as part of SDR delivery is focusing down on those things that are going to make the most difference in the short term. Part of that is about recruitment and retention, speeding that up and improving our retention numbers. And then the other part is really about providing that flexibility of service to ensure that we keep people in for as long as possible.
Lovely. And just a quick one. On our visits as a Defence Select Committee, we have travelled to different NATO countries and spoke to British personnel, serving personnel, who are in NATO positions. One thing that came across to me, and I've asked the ministers this question as well, is the SDR is truly NATO first, and we hear the terminology NATO first all the time. So what I'm picking up is sometimes when officers, serving officers or personnel are sent on NATO roles, it affects their promotion. This is what they're telling me, mainly because that another commanding officer may be from another NATO country, and it doesn't fit within the structures of what the career paths are set for people in those roles, because they've always got to come back and have experience of doing that role before they're considered for promotion. So if we're truly NATO first, how are you as CDS going to ensure that the culture changes so that actually their time spent in NATO command positions does not affect their promotion?
Well, actually, I want to do the opposite. I want to actually enhance their promotion prospects if people have been to NATO and then brought that experience back into the UK, and that's got to be the way we do it. And people will believe it when they see it and feel it, and that's the trick. And we're working hard at the Senior Appointments Committee, and I know the Single Service Promotion Boards are working hard to ensure that those who have got that experience have opportunities to promote.
You picked it up as an issue.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. On to Michelle Scroggum.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you here.
You've been very patient.
I know, yeah, especially in this room. It's very hot today. We didn't deliberately turn it up just for you. But I wanted to ask, we were told in November in the House that there's been some new mandatory training introduced for senior military leaders on how to spot and respond to unacceptable behaviour. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that training, what it entails, and also if you've actually completed the training.
So I'm not quite sure specifically what the reference was in the House, and I'm happy to write to you if you provide me with the details. But more broadly, in terms of the raising our standards work, I've been very clear since I started that this is something that needs to be led right at the very top of defence, and as the head of the military strategic headquarters, I need to lead the chiefs, and I've committed to us meeting frequently to consider the overall programme and the progress we're making against it. There are 5 elements that I see to the programme. The first of which is about leadership. It's about leadership from the most senior levels, but right across the organisation. And one of the benefits to Ms Baker's question is that with the new model under defence reform is that we can be more directive about the single approach to leadership right across defence. And as we roll that out through this thing called the Leadership Edge framework, that's about good leadership more generally, but good leadership brings an organisation where people feel valued and feel part of the organisation, and that helps reduce the prevalence of any unacceptable behaviour. So leadership, there's a big element around data and analytics, so we understand and can where there are particular hotspots and can track our changes, and also can use that to identify where there might be particular problems with leadership. There's a piece around communications to help nudge and develop behaviours. Some of it is straightforward, and one of the components is about tracking unacceptable behaviours and dealing with them and tackling them properly. But the comms around that, and education of our young people coming out of society into the armed forces is a key component. And then finally, there's a strand of work around training and education. So, for example, active bystander training being a key part. I did that a couple of years ago and found that to be a very helpful mechanism, just to give you some tools to deal with that. So I'll be tracking that with the chiefs, but also working closely with our DG, Director General People, and the Vice Chief of Defence Staff to drive that through during my time as CDS.
I mean, this is generally about women in the armed forces, the unacceptable behaviour that they've been subjected to for far too long. Yeah. This is new training that's coming in. I'm quite surprised that you weren't aware of the actual training programme itself. Do you understand the message that it sends if you haven't actually taken that on board and completed it yourself?
Absolutely right, but as I say, I don't actually know precisely what training was being referred to, because there's a whole set of training that we have to do as senior officers, which I am in date with and will continue to do and continue to set the right example. This specifically
is about spotting those behaviours and how to respond to them and then support victims?
Well, why don't we work out exactly what it was, and I'll write to you and confirm one way or the other.
Thank you. I mean, on the messaging in general, I would say sometimes it's so well embedded that it's never noticed. And on my first visit to Admiralty House, I would say that was one of the first things that I took away, was the fact that there was a huge portrait on the wall of I think it was the 4th Earl of Sandwich's mistress. This beautiful portrait, but they were glorifying the fact that he got a 17-year-old mistress that bore him 5 children while his wife was in a mental institution. And I think some of these messages, they're so embedded for so many years that people walk past it and don't even notice. So I think that kind of training and awareness is definitely much needed. So I would appreciate if you could come back to us on that. We heard in December about efforts to test body armour, specifically for women, about the fit, and rather than it actually injuring our female personnel. Will it be treated as an urgent capability requirement should the armour be proved satisfactory?
There are some very specific connotations around urgent capability requirements, but we would definitely consider it to be urgent. My understanding is that trial has gone well, and we will be bringing that. We are already bringing that into service. There's a special name for it. If you like, I will give you the correct name. But yes, we are bringing that into service.
Is it for the UK? Because I understand it is going to be used for Ukraine as a priority, but there hasn't been any mention of being prioritised for our personnel.
So I'm not aware that we would prioritise that for Ukraine over our own people. If we've been through the trial and it works, then we will introduce it across with our people as quickly as we possibly can.
As far as I'm aware, that is the case. That they've said it's going to be prioritised for Ukraine. Yep. Which, wonderful. We'd love to protect the female personnel over there. But I think, again, if we're looking at protecting, that is something that should be prioritised for our female personnel in the UK.
Great.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you much. And finally, Calvin Bailey.
Chief Marshal. Finally. In my constituency of Leighton and Wanstead, I've got 2 wonderful Royal Air Force Cadet Squadrons, 12F and 241, who both have very high levels of ethnic minority people in those units. However, when I look at the services uptake and ability to absorb those young people into the service, it is unjustifiably low, I would say. So what are you doing to address the low levels of service recruitment into from the ethnic minorities and communities like mine?
The first thing I'd say is that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen an increase in representation of ethnic minorities in the armed forces, which I think is a good thing. My whole approach around recruitment and retention is focused on getting the very best people for the armed forces, because that's what the country needs. And so this is fundamentally, for me, is about operational effectiveness. Now, it seems entirely ridiculous to me that if that is the focus, then we shouldn't, it seems ridiculous to me that should mean that we are unable to attract women and ethnic minorities into the armed forces in the kind of numbers that they are represented across society. What we know from, if I lean on my experience from being in the Air Force, is that there are communities across the UK that have very little contact with the armed forces. The cadets do a brilliant job, actually, with developing that knowledge and understanding. But we have to work with what are called in the system the gatekeepers, the parents, the guardians, the teachers, to sell the armed forces as a place that is important to the nation, where you can have a valuable career and where you can contribute to society.
And so that is what I see. And when I go to those squadrons and I go to units such as my previous Air Cadet Unit 56 Squadron in Woolwich, I see and am swamped by parents that are desperate to help get me personally to facilitate their entry into the services. And to be quite frank, that's not good enough, because we know there are stats that link the amount of contact with the military to the uptake. There is very powerful evidence that is the case, and yet these children and these communities are completely written off because the military approach to recruiting now doesn't take the time to put that effort into trying to bridge that gap and recruiting from them.
So I'm not sure I would share your characterisation that it's completely cut off. I think what I see across the armed forces is a determination, commitment to reach communities that don't have ready access or ready understanding of the armed forces. But we don't do enough of that, and we aren't doing it fast enough. And it remains a source of frustration to me that we don't do better in terms of recruiting.
That's what the community outreach teams were there for, and it's for what the ethnic minority networks were there for, to help provide the service with that understanding. So what are you doing to support them? Because as far as I can see, there's been a significant rowing back on commitment to supporting groups that support themselves within the services.
I think the outreach teams still exist in various forms, and that was a key focus certainly in the Air Force a few years ago, and I know the Army and Navy have similar schemes. I'd have to look at the precise details of those numbers. In terms of the networks, the central government has taken an approach towards refining and focusing the networks across government, particularly in the civil service, but I consider that's part of defence, to try to ensure that they are focused on making the most amount of difference. I think that I had a meeting with the Ethnic Minority Network from Defence back in November, and this was a real concern of those, and I'm in conversation with the Permanent Secretary on how we do as much as we can to support those networks who give their time to ensure that members of that network and community are looked after, but also I would want to help them ensure that they can support us in selling what is a fantastic career for anybody, for whatever their background in the armed forces.
It's also sustaining and maintaining those people within the services, and for those people that can't conceive this, if you're an ethnic minority person and you're sent to Benbecula, you might find some of the issues and challenges that you recognise don't exist in that place, and therefore it's useful so you recognise that the networks remain a valid source of support for the...
Absolutely, networks do vital work, and I find my time with them really valuable.
Brilliant. And when we were in AUKUS, we visited we saw the change of approach that the Australian military is having to its non-Australian passport holders, and they've made significant leaps which are really going to challenge our recruitment measures for those non-UK passport holders. We won't have much time to talk on this, but I'd really welcome your agreement to engage with this as a quite pressing issue because of the high numbers of non-UK passport holders that exist within our military. Thank you.
Will do.
And Chief of Defence Staff, we'd all commend your efforts to increase the recruitment of ethnic minority personnel, but you will no doubt be aware that in the 2024 annual report from the Service Complaints Ombudsman, it was noted that ethnic minority personnel were overrepresented when it came to complaints relating to bullying, harassment and discrimination, and therefore May of last year, on behalf of our committee, I did write to the Secretary of State to raise concerns about incidents of racist bullying and harassment, the use of racial slurs, and the culture in which racial biases disadvantage ethnic minority personnel. Now, what are you going to be personally doing to be ensuring that there is a culture change so that we can deal with the problems at the moment within the armed forces and then therefore recruit more individuals? Because if we don't change the culture at present, then that will have a devastating impact on our ability to encourage more people to join.
Yeah. So it starts with personal leadership and setting the right example. It starts with trying to learn and understand from members of the networks the pressures and difficulties that people from particular backgrounds have, educating myself. And then systemically, it's making sure that we have a set of processes and systems that identify, deal with and call out and deal with that behaviour, and that we inculcate that attitude right through the leadership and training systems that we talked about earlier in the process. So I have a personal responsibility to lead as well as I can and educate myself, but I also have a responsibility to make sure the system works as effectively as possible. And that raising our standards work, whilst it may have come initially out of women in defence, it actually applies to everybody in defence. It's about making us as good as we can be, getting the best out of our people so we can attract and retain the very best people so that we can be the very best armed forces we can be. And that is the business reason for doing it, not just the ethical reason and moral reason for doing it.
Thank you very much. Chief Defence Staff, you have been very, very generous with your time, and you've been in the hot seat for now over 2 hours, so you have earned a well-deserved break, but please do note that you have our very best wishes as a committee, and despite the questioning today, we are very much on your side, and we wish you the very, very best in your service, and thank you very much indeed for your service. And please do convey to our brave servicemen and women our gratitude for their service. So with that, I bring today's meeting to a conclusion. Order.